Welcome to the Magical Salon, where two regular people, Amanda and James, explore mystical ideas and big questions. From books to pop culture, if it's a doorway to something deeper, we're probably into it. We're not experts, and maybe you aren't either, but that's kind of the point. Greetings and welcome back to the Magical Salon. I'm your acolyte, Amanda.
And I am your co-host, James.
Right, so today we're diving into the Tao Te Ching, a classic Chinese text written by Lao-tzu that serves as one of two core texts in Taoism. At a base level, it describes the Tao, which is a sort of divine energy that is the source of all existence, as well as how to be in alignment with it, also known as the wuwei. As we mentioned in one of the earlier episodes, I took a class in college called Asian philosophy, which is interesting that it was called Asian philosophy and not Asian religions. Just an aside. And one of the texts we read was the Tao Te Ching. And it obviously resonated with me, resonated with you. But in terms of structure, the book is different than something like the Bible, just because it's kind of written in verse. At least in our version, it includes the original Chinese characters as well as some explanations from a teacher called Professor Ching. It sounds a little bit scary that it's sort of in verse. It's not like poetry. I mean, it kind of is, I guess, in a way, but it's easier to understand than what you might think of when you just hear, ooh, it's in verse.
I mean, I would just say to that, I think it's incredibly readable, and I think it's I would describe it as pithy. It's just very short, little kind of nuggets of wisdom in some ways. And each chapter, they kind of flow into each other, but you could also just kind of flip to a random page. You don't really need to have read what came before it. It's not plot driven, really. So I think it's pretty accessible.
So then as another aside, because I love a good aside, so the version of the book that I have, the version of the Tao Te Ching that I have, is the one that my teacher in college recommended for the course. And so on inside the front cover, so it's a used book, and inside the front cover there's a dedication from August 1983 to a person called Susan. And similarly to episode 2, when we talk about reading as magic, I think the idea of a used book is really cool because not only is someone from another time speaking to you, but you also feel the weight of everyone else who has read the book and held the book in their literal hands. Books are meant to be shared after all. So the message is from Jane Fagao, who along with her husband were students of Professor Ching, who is the one kind of like giving the guidance on the Tao Te Ching. And she and her husband were core faculty members of the traditional Eastern Arts program, which was established at Naropa University in 1975. That's in Boulder, Colorado. So her husband, Baton, was a published poet, and the both of them, not only did they train on Taoism, train others on Taoism, but they also ran in circles with sort of beat writer figures such as Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, and Ken Casey as well.
Well, so we know who those people are, so what are they known for? Burroughs, like William Burroughs, that is a beat writer, author, known for Naked Lunch, among other books that he's written. But I actually recently read that, so that's a weird synchronicity. And then Ken Kesey is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He wrote that. Obviously, that's it was made into a movie as well, I think with Jack Nicholson.
Everybody knows if it's made into a movie, it's good.
It's more that these are very important cultural figures at a point in time from an era that we were not alive during. But it's interesting that this copy that you had in college, that you and I have both read from, is in some ways not a descendant, but a text that was in the hands of somebody that was a teacher or related to the author of this specific translation.
Yes. But also, I would say the Beat generation, specifically in terms of writers, has always intrigued me. Because it's 60s, 70s, counterculture, that kind of thing. Like people are doing LSD. It's just like an interesting time, and some of the writing that came out of that time was very interesting. And Allen Ginsberg, of course, wrote Howl. He's like a pretty famous poet. That's one of his most famous poems, which I remember reading in school and stuff, in college, I think. But he's also a very influential, like, Buddhist figure. Like, I think he's sort of popularized with, like, helping spread Buddhism, like, specifically to an American audience, because, you know, he, like, helped co-found the Buddhist Review. So back to the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah, that's quite an aside.
I think one of the biggest sort of things it talks about and questions that it raises is sort of like, what is the way and what does it mean to live in accordance with the Tao or the way?
From a basic perspective, the Tao Te Ching, I was kind of doing a little bit of preliminary research, right? And essentially, the translation for the Tao Te Ching, you could think of it as being called the Book of the Way and its Power. That's a translation for the title. I guess it's broken up into 2 sections, apparently. So the first 37 chapters are about the Tao, and the Tao means way. That's the translation. And it's kind of the primordial source of all being. And then the day in the Tao Te Ching, that is kind of virtue or power as a translation. And it's virtue that you attain from realizing the Tao. And it's kind of a way, day are qualities and elements of your nature that you receive from this, the Tao, the way.
Okay, so pause. So what the heck does primordial mean?
I think the intro line is, the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. Essentially saying it's beyond human comprehension.
So does that just mean that it's old?
No, I think it means it beyond, like it's almost a God equivalent, but not embodied as a God in the traditional Western sense, where it's a physical person or being.
Okay, I got it. Thanks to the interwebs, we have 3 definitions. Existing at or from the beginning of time. Basic and fundamental. Or in terms of biology, it means in the earliest stage of development. So to your point, it's what was there before anything else is there.
It's kind of the fabric of our entire universal existence. You can't point to it and say, this is what it is, because it's so beyond our conception as humans. However, because it is the fabric of our universe, or the creator, the source, you're a part of it, or it is embedded within your life, whether you recognize that or not, is kind of how I always... It's a very interesting concept, just the Tao in general, and the way it's mentioned in the texts.
So to play devil's advocate, how is that different than sort of the Catholic version of God? And I'm using that as a touch point because that's our most familiar touch point, having both been raised Catholic.
I mean, it's a huge concept, right? And I don't think God is a good translation of it. So I kind of wouldn't call it that. I would more just say it's kind of a fundamental element.
It's not an element though, because it's from which all the elements arise.
Right, it's the one, or the underlying, it's kind of hard to explain, right? And I think it is unnameable, right? But it also says in the book, from it all things are made, basically, or from the Tao, the 10,000 things are manifested, or everything in the world exists because of the Tao, including you as a human, your consciousness. So maybe you could call it like the universal consciousness or something. I'm not sure.
It's somewhat hard to conceptualize, or at least it was difficult for me to conceptualize, having come from Catholicism when I first encountered the Tao Te Ching. But now that it's been like 10 years since I first read this and encountered it, I do understand it better. So I will say that. I think it's best understood through examples. I don't know, like, would you say, for some reason, whenever I think of the Tao, I just think of the Big Bang Theory, because isn't, like, science says that the Big Bang Theory is the origin of everything within like our known world, right? But it's still, there's a question, which is obviously, how did that happen? Like, what caused the Big Bang Theory? There was something there before, the Tao, right? The Tao is what came before all creation and what everything will return to, right?
Yeah. The way I think of the way, the Tao, is balance. There's universal balance, right? Within the oceans, there's balance between the waves or whatever. And I think one of the and I've read this book probably like 10 different times. We have multiple different copies and translations. But one of the copies that I was reading, the Tao is the ocean. And we, our individual lives, are like ripples or waves in the ocean. It's kind of a silly thought to say, as a wave, explain the ocean. Like, you're just a small little fragment. You have no idea that you're a part of this huge thing. Kind of like a fish in water, right? They don't know they're in water. It's a fundamental thing. They don't exist without it, so they're kind of blind to it. And maybe that's the Tao, like consciousness, right? Like, what is consciousness? I don't know. But everybody has it, including, and I think this book kind of talks about animals, plants.
But like in the What's This Tao podcast, What's This Tao All About podcast, the main guy, the PhD guy, is talking about how, yeah, if you imagine the entire world as an ocean, each person is more akin to a water droplet. So every water droplet is unique, but at the same time, there's nothing really different between all the droplets making up the ocean, right? So it's sort of like, again, this idea of duality, but also beneath the duality is the one true thing.
And I think that's why I think it's a cool theory, right? Because it is not dogmatic in the sense of a Catholic upbringing, the 10 deadly sins or whatever, right? Instead, it's more just like, these are some frameworks. The Tao, we can't even name what this thing is, but it's there, it exists. But all things are made from it, and all things return to it. But the Tao is everlasting. Like, it will not go away, right? You will die. The Tao will not. It will continue on. So it's kind of, how do you align with that and then live in an attempt to live in harmony with this much larger overarching, undulation or current that's beyond human, right? Beyond the planet even. Like, the Earth and the sun are going to blow up in 10 million years, but the Tao will still continue, whether we are here or not. Which is kind of why I think I said it's beyond our comprehension, right?
It's funny because when you first started talking, you basically described Taoism as a theory, and thinking about religions as theories is an interesting way of thinking about it. I think one of the things about Taoism that I always really liked, and one of the things that resonated with me immediately when I first learned about Taoism, is the concept of wuwei, or non-action. I kind of think non-action, for me, I kind of understand it as intuitive action. Think of those days when you kind of move from one activity to another with little thought. You're not rationalizing what you're gonna do next. You're not planning things out too much. You're not stressing over next steps or concerns you may have. You're just moving with the flow, effortlessly moving from one thing to the other, very naturally. So I feel like the key to wuwei is that flow aspect. So when people say, like some of these phrases that we hear a lot, I was in a flow, I was in the zone, oh, I lost track of time, where did the day go? Specifically, people will often say those phrases in terms of, like when they're in the deep throes of creation, people often use phrases like that. Oh, I was in the zone, I just, typed up a 15-page paper that's due tomorrow, or whatever the case is. So for me, I think that's one of the easiest ways for me to both conceptualize wuwei, but also practice it in an everyday way, is through creating.
This is why I think Taoism and the idea of Tao is so cool, because that's your spoke on the wheel, so to speak, to use that analogy. So think then of wuwei and non-action. A lot of people get that in sports. they're in the zone. Their game face is on. You're not paying attention to what time it is. Maybe you look at like the timer for the game to see how much time you have left, but you're not like, oh, I should be doing this later. You're completely invested in the sport that you are participating in. Or even if you think of running, a runner's high, at some point, maybe it starts off as a slog, but then eventually you get into a rhythm or a flow. And you're like, oh, this isn't that bad. I'm outside. I'm in nature. The sun's good. There's some birds. Oh, wow. Oh, and then before you know it, oh, I just ran 3 miles. But the idea of doing that while sitting on a couch, it's like hard to fathom how you could do it. How do you motivate yourself to do that? But then you get lost in the moment or absorbed in something else so that you are producing or creating something or contributing to something without it feeling like work. And I think that's a big distinction of the wuwei concept. You are getting things done and being, I wouldn't use the word productive, that's like a very Western idea, but you are creating and manifesting things that are tangible at some point, but it doesn't feel like a chore or work.
I think it's a way of conceptualizing being present, because when you are so present in the moment, you're so busy embodying the moment, that there's no such thing really as time. So when you're fully in the moment observing things, and that doesn't necessarily mean that when you are fully in the moment, I don't know, like in the What's This Tao podcast, like he talks about being present as one of the key practices, and how you're like, it's the practice of observing and not judging, right? So it's not like, oh, I can only be present, you know, when the circumstances are aligned in such a way. It's being present all the time, even if what you are being present of or what you're observing is something negative, right? Because those are just external associations at the end of the day. But I think fully embodying the moment even takes you past some of those observations and into like almost non-being.
So you mentioned What's This Tao About podcast, which is very good, right? Definitely giving a shout out there. And it's Dr. Carl Totten is in the beginning episodes. I think he's on hospice. So the podcast is still sort of continuing, but the person we're specifically speaking to is in the earlier episodes. Specifically episode 1, I've returned to and re-listened to that episode numerous times when I'm having various existential crises, because he does such a good job of just kind of distilling. There's so much stuff going on in the world, but intuitively, there's this short little book with 81 chapters that kind of resonates. And it does feel like there's a there when I read it, personally speaking.
Another tenet is letting go and not resisting. They talk a lot in the Tao Te Ching about being like water, because water just flows and goes where it will. It doesn't resist or try and control anything or try and go a certain way. It acts according to nature. That's key, according to nature. And in college, I remember my professor talked a bit about not resisting your circumstances, and he used this example of a Taoist master going outside, walking around, and it begins to rain. But instead of being mad or worried about his clothes or whatever else, he just smiles because it's happening already. There's no point in fighting it. And I think the takeaway there is just to be and not to wish for anything different. Be present again.
I think that's a very good point. And in some ways, I think it's a perfect lead into this week's weekly wisdom already, which is early, but you brought it up. And it is I don't know if I have a favorite chapter, but chapter 8, I remember the first time I read it was like, whoa. And so I'll read the actual chapter. But it is water essentially being described, and how water is the ultimate element in our world. And if you embody the qualities of water, you are living with the Tao. So chapter 8, and this is the translation that you were referring to from college, Lectures on the Tao Te Ching by Man Jian Chen. The best attitude is like water. Water is a positive benefit to all things without competing with them. It seeks out those places abominated by man. Thereby it approaches the Tao. For one's dwelling, choose ground well. In cultivating one's mind or heart, search the deeps well. In dealing with people, treat them well. In speaking, know how to keep one's word. In governing, rectify the self well. In serving, do one's best. In acting, choose the time well. Only by not competing can one be without reproach. Water in the Grand Canyon. Over thousands of years, this little trickle or stream carved out a massive hole in the ground, right? It finds the low point, but it thrives. Like, it doesn't care, right? It just goes with the flow, kind of to wuwei. Like, it just is water.
It's an interesting parallel for me. Like, the pinnacle of being, or one of the pinnacles of being, is to be like water, because water is simultaneously a soft force. Like, people associate it with healing, like something that's gentle, but then at the same time, water is also extremely powerful. Like, you think of a waterfall, or, you know, like a tsunami or something. Like, a massive amount of water is an extremely powerful force. So that's an interesting concept. But then the other thing that I really like about that passage that you just read is like the last line, like, he who doesn't compete cannot be competed with. That's a baller line, because, and we both think about that a lot and say that to each other.
Well, and I think the reason I wanted to read that chapter was because you were talking about how it's about letting go of control. And the idea of competing is kind of the ego. You want to be better than somebody else, right? But to the chapter's point, water is a benefit to everyone, but nobody views it as a competitor. Like, nobody is like, oh, what's this water doing over here, right? Everybody's like, sweet, water. The guy is getting rained on. He's just like, yeah, I'm enjoying this, right? It's raining, I'm outside, I'm gonna get wet, I can be upset or happy about it. It's kind of going back to the map of consciousness. Water just is, and it is a benefit to everyone. Kind of like a human should try to help others, and that is being loving, which is higher on the consciousness map. Nobody is mad when you help somebody genuinely and out of love. But if you help someone for the wrong reason, or you're angry or bitter or pouting while helping, people still might not be that appreciative because you acted like it was a burden and you complained the entire time. And I'm speaking to me like when I was a kid. It'd be like, oh, help mow the yard or whatever. It's like, I might mow the yard, but if I just complain about it the entire time, your parents aren't really like grateful.
Well, even if you can't enjoy it, if you could just do it without having that constant dialogue of criticism in your mind, or of complaints, because even if you don't voice them, it could still be in your mind. But the idea is not necessarily that you need to enjoy every task you ever do, but that you can just do it and not be so judgmental of the observations that are assailing your physical corporeal frame. It's interesting that you mentioned, well, I don't know if you said force versus power, Dr. Hawkins' map of consciousness, but that's kind of like where I thought you were gonna go with it. But it kind of reminded me back to Jane and Baton Fago, whose book we have, of course. So I told you they were both teachers, but they have this quote that's on the website where they say, those people who say you must use force usually have excess strength or practice with a hard style and won't give it up. They can't believe that at the limit of suppleness lies a different quality of strength. Such people never obtain the essence of Taiji. And also, a poor student is hard and uses force, but a good one must be supple without force. Not to beat a dead horse and bring up Avatar: The Last Airbender in literally every episode we produce, but it does remind me of Aang in the final season's finale, where he chooses not to use force and kill the Fire Lord, and instead to choose suppleness. So it kind of goes back to the kind of ancient debate of like, what does it mean to really be strong? Showing vulnerability is also strength. Being soft is a form of strength. And I think that's kind of also what it's getting at. Like, you don't need to force your way through everything. There's a different approach, and that's the approach perhaps that's more in line with the Tao.
And that's interesting because the idea that you're talking about there is from a theory perspective, right? Going back to, is it a theory or religion? A lot of the book, specifically the latter half, it's talking about how one should govern. And in it, a key point is you should not be forcing the people. You, as a ruler, you should let things be, and through their own natural way and course, the people you are ruling will find harmony and balance by themselves. You don't need to be ruling with an iron fist. That's kind of the claim, right? It's almost like a rule book. It can be applied to anything, right? It's a rule book for rulers. It's a rule book that you could look at. I shouldn't say rule book. It's a guiding North Star in some ways.
I don't know if this is too technical, but I don't think so. So somewhere in the Tao Te Ching, it talks about how, kind of as we have been discussing, the universe is created out of Qi, and that Qi is divided into yin and yang. Tai Chi or Tai Chi means supreme ultimate. That's what Tai Chi means. And that's the one that's preceding the duality, which is the yin and the yang. But I guess, do you have any thoughts on yin and yang?
Going again to the duality concept, that's what yin and yang, like from a human perspective, maybe the Tao to us manifests as good or bad through the yin and yang, but ultimately it is still a part of the fabric of the universe. Like rain is rain. If you think that it is bad or good, that's you putting judgment on it. So even if you used the example earlier of water can be very powerful in the instance of floods, we would say that's bad, it flooded. But to water and the elements, that's not inherently good or bad. We are judging it from a human perspective as good or bad. There's some, I have like little snippets that I think would be interesting to hear your take on, because it talks about so much stuff. And these are very pithy, short little snippets here. So in chapter 48, speaking about letting go and attachment, it talks about knowledge. And I'm curious what your thoughts are. So chapter 48, in pursuing knowledge, one accumulates daily. In practicing Tao, one loses daily. I remember in college when you were reading this the first time, we were like, does the Tao hate knowledge? Because it kind of says, be dumb. Try not to learn as much as possible. Like the Tao, you should be giving up attachment. You shouldn't be trying to acquire more, because that's how you get out of balance. That's more of the ego. You want a bigger house, a better car, but it's like to live in harmony and go with the flow. You don't need any of those things. And you should be trying to give up external things that you look to for validation.
Yeah, well, for me, it just takes me back to the uncarved block, which is considered like the pinnacle of being within the Tao Te Ching, I would say. Like, that's what you're supposed to be, is you're supposed to be like the uncarved block. And I remember when I first read it, the Tao Te Ching, I never understood it. Like, to your point, I was like, oh, so they want you to be like, basically like a simpleton in some ways. Like, that's sort of how it's presented. But if you're familiar with the tarot deck, it's akin to the Fool card, which is the first part of the spiritual journey, but also the end, right? Because it's cyclical. The Fool is often innocent and naive, like that's how they're presented. But at the same time, they kind of have a child's mind. They go with the flow. They have beginner's mind. Like those are the kind of characteristics they have. They're not really afraid, right? They're not living in a fear-based reality. And their mind is open to all the possibilities. And so I think the uncarved block is sort of like the Taoist version of that, where it's somebody who others might be like, yeah, well, like, why don't you learn more or whatever? And it's like, I have all that I need, right? Like the uncarved block in the Tao Te Ching is always described as pure potential. It's like your natural state. That's why it's uncarved block, right? Not a carved block. It's not a carved wooden statue. It's an uncarved block according to nature. Like that's sort of the idea. But it also reminds me, I know I'm really going off on a tangent here, but when you mentioned knowledge, it reminded me of another book that I read on Taoism, the Tao de Pooh.
The Tao of Pooh.
Well, but he describes Winnie the Pooh as being who you should be, right? He's the uncarved block. So that also helps explain the idea of the uncarved block better if you're interested. But one of the things that he kind of talks about, maybe in the intro, is just how Some people approach things like Taoism purely from a knowledge-based perspective. They want to enhance all their knowledge. It's almost like they're going and collecting a bunch of information and chronicling it in a very rational, intellectualizing way, when in fact you should be practicing, right? It's like you can know a lot of things, but at the end of the day, not know anything of actual worth. So I think that's what they're getting at in terms of Taoism. It's like direct revelation is sort of what you should be seeking.
And I think to your point earlier, you mentioned something about the uncarved block, kind of maybe like, what is it, tabula rasa, like blank slate even. And the idea too of learning and intellectualizing is a very thought, mind forward approach to things and understanding. Whereas I kind of think the Tao is a bit more intuitive. Like it should be from the heart. You can just kind of feel if something is right or not. And even in chapter 19, there's like kind of a list. And at one point it says, I believe these 3 statements show that words are inadequate. And I think that's what the issue is with the Tao, is it's beyond human conception. So words are inadequate. And going back to your concept, you need to experience directly. You can read all of the books about it in the world, but you kind of have to feel it through action directly. It can't be told.
Well, it goes back to theory and practice, sort of. If all you do is have and seek knowledge, and I'm thinking kind of like from a very academic way, then all you will do is have a bunch of knowledge. That doesn't necessarily mean that you will be enlightened. You'll just know a lot of stuff about enlightenment.
I think the other thing though too is, I mean, the idea of, there's so many great quotes from this, like he who competes cannot be competed with. This is also the book where the idea of like the journey of 1,000 steps begins. Although at this translation, I think it might be, I think it uses a different word than steps. Like the human want is to just jump to the end, but the journey is kind of the process at the same point. Or the process is the journey. So from a creating perspective, creating is the magic.
No, I mean, well, again, it kind of goes back to the map of consciousness, in which Dr. Hawkins is talking about how if you're super fixated on the material gains, i.e. the destination, you will never go higher on the map of consciousness. So like for me, like if I'm too fixated on trying to get all my work published and trying to become a writer that people know, I'm focused on the gains, I'm focused on the destination. Not only am I not able to go higher on the map of consciousness, but I'm also genuinely not enjoying the process that I'm doing in this, like I'm not being present. I'm pining after something that may or may not ever happen when all I ever have is this moment now.
That reminds me of that What's This Tao All About? I think in it, Dr. Carl Totten, this first episode, I think he specifically comments about the eternal now. It is here and then gone in an instant. That moment will never, I as a person cannot go back in time. It is gone. So I can either enjoy every moment as they are, or that's it, right? They're gone then. Then you're living in the past, but then I'm not living in the new now, right? It's kind of always change. When you were talking about the parable of the sower, and I was in, I think, the other episode, and the Tao is change, right? It's eternal, never-ending, everlasting.
Yeah, well, so my favorite episode of podcast What's This Tao All About is episode 50, which you should be. It's the episode where they take on what's the meaning of life. And, well, as you know, Dr. Totten, right, is his name, right? Dr. Totten is talking to the other guy who's like a journalist. Todd and Totten. Okay, so Todd, yeah, and Dr. Totten are speaking. Like the journalist, so Todd, the journalist, is just talking about how there's no inherent meaning in life, and how when he first sort of realized that, it was extremely depressing and overwhelming and obviously very existential. But then he started to kind of look at it differently. There is no point, so you are free to do anything. You get to create your own reason for being here. And that's a liberating idea. And so then Dr. Totten chimed in and he was like, yeah, the only thing you have to do is be here now. that is the meaning of life. If you keep saying, oh, I will be present, or I will be happy when this happens, or I'll be grateful when I become a famous writer. It's like, you're no longer in the present moment. That may never happen.
Not only that, but think of what you see in, like, obviously neither one of us is like wildly successful, but when you see people that are, if your dream is to become a professional singer or to make it in Hollywood, and then I'll have it all, or I'm gonna win the lottery and then I'll have it all, you're externalizing joy to an extent, and you're also putting a lot on an outcome. What inevitably seems to happen is once people get that goal, whatever it is, they make it to the big leagues, they win the lottery, they're still unhappy. And that's another thing. Like, you personally, and the map of consciousness talks about it too, right? Like, you control your own mentality. And that is the only thing you can control. You can't even control how others perceive you. You can only control yourself. And living in the now and trying to find balance, I think, is a better way. Or it's not a better way, but it's a good principle to try and live in the now, is to just find the joy where you are as it is, instead of in a future mythical, fantastical scenario.
That's the problem with using those win clauses, is that even if it does happen for you, to your point, you'll just raise the bar even higher to something else. And then again, it's out of reach.
And like, yeah, it kind of goes to the competing idea as well, right? If you don't compete with anyone, that removes a lot of external pressure, right?
And internal pressure.
Kind of a way of letting go, ego-wise. I think it's a better way of thinking about it, though, too, because if you think of when am I competing, it's a way for you to kind of heat check if you are being very egocentric.
Well, yeah, because it's like, at the end of the day, am I competing or am I just performing?
I mean, even taking it a step further. So remember the map of consciousness. Driving. Some people drive like hostile. That's the only way I can describe it. Like, they're angry and they're zipping in and out of traffic. They're honking at everyone. They're flipping people off. And it's like, what are you doing? Like, you're competing. You're just driving somewhere ultimately. Every other car on the road is not trying to get to the same place you are. All they're trying to do is get somewhere.
Yeah, so the road is an interesting metaphor for life, because I do agree. I think your personality on the road does say a lot about how you are in life, because honestly, I'm not very zen on the road. Like, I do get mad. Like, I'm obviously not... It's like, why am I in such a rush? Like, why don't I just be late to the thing?
That's why the map of consciousness, the idea of letting people go in front of you, makes sense, right? Because you view it as a form of like, I'm not letting them get in front of me. I might miss this light, and then I'll just be wasting another 2 minutes in my car. It's like, you're competing at that point, right? You're just being petty to be petty, instead of just like, oh, I'll let this person in, right?
You have to let everybody in front of you, though. That's the key. That's what Dr. Hawkins said. Everybody.
So then do you never get anywhere?
I mean, there's something to be said for it, right? Because I would say, so on the road, you know, there's like it's kind of like custom for you to let one car go in front of you, then you go, then the car behind you is supposed to let somebody pull out in front of them. It doesn't always work like that, right? But that's the idea. But Dr. Hawkins is like, no, like, you should just let everybody in front. It's like a completely, like, because then you really do have to give up competing, because it's not just like, oh, I'll just like let this one person get in front of me and then like I'll feel a little bit better about my day. It's like, no, I'm letting them all in front of me.
Then you'll feel really good.
It's more, you just have to give up more is the point.
Letting go is what you do to be more like the Tao. You have to give up things.
Because if you only give up one thing, then you're very fixated on the one thing rather than just giving it all up.
And that's kind of the ego as well. Like, you give up one thing and then you get to say, I'm a good person now. I donated once. I volunteered for 3 hours at work. It was company organized, but I'm such a good person now. But you never help ever again. So it's like, well, I guess you helped a little, but you're really just doing it to feel better about yourself, not to genuinely help.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Do you think your motivations in those situations matter? Like, if you do a lot of good things, even if your motivations are bad, like, if you did a lot of great deeds, but your only motivation for doing them was so that you could get into heaven, would they still be considered good deeds, or no, because of your intentions are bad?
To go back to the Tao Te Ching, we've been focusing on the Tao Te Ching by Lao-tzu, as you mentioned. I do want to make a quick an aside, as you like to do, about Chuang-Tzu, who is also like one of the seminal figures in Taoism, or credited with being a forming voice, for lack of a better word. For the listener, Chuang-Tzu has a dream, and maybe you've heard this story and didn't know where it came from. So Chuang-Tzu had a dream. One night he went to sleep and he dreamt that he was a butterfly. He was flying around from flower to flower, feeling the breeze. It's perfect, right? He's just floating blissfully on a perfect day. And he was convinced that he was a butterfly. But then he woke up and he realized that he was dreaming. So he's like convinced he's a butterfly, wakes up, and then he says, well, was I Chuang-Tzu dreaming that I was a butterfly? Or am I now really a butterfly dreaming that I am Chuang-Tzu? And the idea is like, what is real, right? Dreams are completely real to you when you're dreaming. And then you wake up and you're like, well, obviously I wasn't late for school. I haven't been in school in 10 years. But in that moment, in your dream, that's super real to you, right? And it's kind of flipping, to me, it's almost consciousness question too, because he's equating a butterfly with being capable of dreaming about being a human.
Dreams are like your brain just having fun while you're asleep to some extent, or working out issues or stressors or whatever else. So it's ultimately a product of your brain, right? But that's kind of what reality is as well, because how do I know that that reality is really how I see it? What if my brain is just projecting it differently? Why is it that this is more real than what my brain produces in sleep?
Dreams, while not being real, let's say they aren't real, they're not this reality, they still have impact on this reality. Like, you can have a bad dream, wake up, and then be in a bad mood the next day because of your dream. So it does impact this world still too, right?
At the very least, I mean, dreams are not, it's not like dreams are a one-to-one interpretation of whatever issue you may be having in your so-called real life. It's not necessarily going to be mirrored in a very one-to-one way in a dream form. It might like take a completely different format and be sort of an extrapolation. But I do think that you can sort of receive messages or things that you may be in need of through dreams. But you have to be open to it, right? Because if you just discount everything that you ever encounter in a dream, it's kind of like in real life. Like, you can choose to see synchronicities or you can choose to ignore them. Those are two different ways of operating. But if you choose to see them, you only see them more. And I think dreams are like that too.
This copy of the book that we have, the Tao Te Ching, you gave an intro and started and opened up about how those people were directly students of the person that taught this specific translation. But then also, we read that for years and had no idea. It was only in preparation for this episode that we learned that. This book has been lent to my mom, my sister, I think, has read this. We've been sharing it without ever even knowing, which is kind of a cool thought. And honestly, 1983, so that's what, over 40 years ago? And this is still being passed around and read. And that's a cool thought as well. It lives on.
That is a good point because, again, that's a synchronicity or a connection that was surprising to me, that seems like magic. In the message, she basically says, like, to Susan, thank you for your loving insights, which is interesting because this is how I perceive it. This is my thought. She's giving this to, for some reason, I perceived it as Jane Fagau giving this book to a student of hers. So, because she's a teacher, right? So that seems most reasonable. But that's interesting, right? To say to your student, thank you for your loving insights. That's a completely different dichotomy than what I would consider to be the sort of Western mentor-student relationship, which is I'm gonna teach you a bunch of stuff, write it down, and regurgitate it back to me. And that's kind of also borne out in that Buddhist Review magazine where they were charting like the 10-year history, and this was like in 1997 or something. And they were talking about like this renowned Buddhist master who had passed away, and he was like mentoring this like really young dude, but they were both learning a lot from each other, right? It was student and teacher learning from each other. Yes, I might be further on the path than you, but I'm not done learning.
Well, that kind of goes back to being an uncarved block too. Like as a teacher, maybe people look to you, but you are still trying to retain the openness and open to other interpretations or other thoughts that people might have about it.
Well, and the other synchronicity for me is that quote, "The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." I had that, I still have that engraved on a ring that I wore on my ring finger throughout pretty much all of high school. I had no idea what the quote was from. I had no idea it was spiritual. I just liked the message of it.
It's very cool. Like, is that the way, right? Like, when you think of the way and how do you align with the way, if you see a lot of synchronicities, does that mean you're kind of finding your way?
Hopefully.
There's a bunch of different translations of it. I think it's very cool to read the different translations because while it's the same book, you would be surprised how different people can translate things.
It's interesting because translating, not that I have any experience with it, is definitely more of an art rather than a science. And of course, having been almost an English literature student, like having taken a lot of English lit classes, the translation of certain things was always of the utmost importance. You needed the right version, right? And it did matter. Anything with a lot of depth that's kind of conceptual and hard to understand, like the Tao, I think reading different translations could help you get closer to understanding it.
It's a good book.
Yeah, I would rate it as 50 raindrops in a glass half full. So in other words, if you find yourself in a rainstorm, maybe just stand there and soak it all in, literally. But if it's a thunderstorm, maybe go inside. Don't tempt fate too much. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. See you next Wednesday on The Magical Salon.